For those of you who are visiting for the first time, Conrad Grebel is one of 4 church colleges affiliated with the University of Waterloo. Founded by Ontario Mennonites in 1963, Conrad Grebel's mission is to seek wisdom, nurture faith, and pursue justice and peace in service to church and society. That mission, seeking wisdom, nurturing mature faith, and pursuing justice and peace in a spirit of service, is the reason why the Center for the Study of Religion and Peace welcomed the opportunity to host tonight's conversation about the foundations of peacemaking in the Qur'an and the Bible. The purpose of the Center for the Study of Religion and Peace here at Conrad Grebel is to utilize research, dialogue, and public education activities in ways that help to advance knowledge and awareness of religious contributions to peace, and to enhance the capacity of religious communities to engage contemporary conflict issues and practice the peaceful values they profess. To explore the foundations of peacemaking in Muslim and Christian scriptures, we're privileged to have with us tonight 2 distinguished guests, Shabir Ali and David Shenk. For insights into the Quranic foundations of peacemaking, we have Shabir Ali, who holds a BA in Religious Studies from Laurentian University in Sudbury, with a specialization in biblical literature. He also holds an MA and a PhD from the University of Toronto, with a specialization in Quranic exegesis. Dr. Ali is the president of the Islamic Information and Dawah Center International in Toronto, where he functions as Imam. He's also the author of numerous publications and booklets. He travels internationally to represent Islam in public lectures and interfaith dialogues, and explains Islam on a weekly television program called Let the Qur'an Speak. I understand that past episodes of this Vision TV show are available on YouTube, is that correct? As well as on your website. To guide us on the biblical foundations of peacemaking, we're joined by David Shenk, who holds a doctorate in religious studies education with coursework in anthropology at New York University. Dr. Shenk has spent much of his life in East Africa, specifically Tanzania, Kenya, and Somalia, where he started out with his parents, who were working as missionaries with Eastern Mennonite missions. He has also served in global church networks and missions, most recently as academic dean at the Lithuania Christian College. At present, he is global consultant with Eastern Mennonite missions. His interest in relevant Christian presence, peacemaking, and witness in a world of religious pluralism has taken him to more than 100 countries. And the issue of the Christian-Muslim relationship is very central to his ongoing concerns. He's authored or edited 15 books and booklets, and has taught in a variety of universities and seminaries in the US and internationally. And his travels have taken him to places such as Iran, where he recently engaged in Shia Muslim Mennonite Christian dialogues. But before turning things over to our 2 distinguished guests, who are both very well qualified to speak about peace in their respective religious traditions, I would simply like to affirm the importance and value of meetings like this one tonight, which enable us to meet in peace, not just to talk about peace, and reflect together on both our similarities and our differences, without expecting that there's going to be agreement. Far too often, we content ourselves with talking about each other. This evening, we have the opportunity to talk to and with each other, to ask questions that really matter, and to listen closely to voices we may not hear every day, so that we may come to better know one another, and perhaps even to know one another as neighbors in communities like this one. But before we proceed with our 2 presentations, we would like to start on a note of prayer, with a prayer from both Christianity and Islam. So we have prayers that will be offered, I believe, first from Imam Muhammad Abu-al-Ez, and then from Pastor Lester Kale. Are Lester and Imam Muhammad available?
Lester is available. We are still working on our second.
All right.
I think Imam Muhammad was probably had difficulty finding a place.
That is understandable. I'm impressed that we have such a turnout despite the construction and everything.
I I invited her to. Would you invite her?
Yes, she
All
will.
right.
Okay.
So instead of Imam Muhammad Abu Ez, we'll have Idrissa Pandit, who teaches studies in Islam at Renison College here at University of Waterloo. So, Idrissa?
Good evening, everybody. I'm still waiting for Imam Muhammad to show up. I guess he's not here. Anyways, peace be with all of you, and a very, very quick and short prayer. If we take a moment of silence, that would be wonderful, and pray in the way that you wish. However, I'll wish you with a greeting of peace. We say Assalamu alaikum, which is peace be with you. The only other thing I can think of right now is the Quranic verse. I'm sure that we're going to hear a lot more about it tonight, which speaks to the idea of oneness of humanity or oneness of community, and God's purpose in creating us as different people made of different nations and tribes, with the whole purpose of engaging one another. So my prayer tonight is that out of this discussion, hopefully, we will all learn a little bit about how to engage with one another, so we can live together as a peaceful community here in this town, as well as citizens of the world. So in the name of God, the most merciful, the most beneficent, I pray that we all have a good evening of learning and brotherhood and sisterhood. Thank you.
Thank you, Idrissa. And now Lester Kale, formerly pastor of Floridale Mennonite Church.
I think you said it very well. For all of us, we pray in a variety of ways, but we express those same views. And so I'm privileged tonight to share with you. Let's pray together. Dear God, you have created each of us as unique individuals, but you have created each of us to live in a culture. And in that particular culture where we grew up, we came to believe and understand about you as God. We heard stories about you as we read from our holy books. And you have taught us. We read stories about Jesus and as he walked in this world and taught about peace and understanding about you. And so tonight, as we gather from a variety of settings, a variety of cultures, but one God, we pray that you would give us wisdom to learn more about you as God, as we listen to the writings of holy people that have been passed on to us, that we might learn and dialogue together to work towards peace in a world of conflict and violence. May your Spirit give us wisdom. Amen.
Amen.
Thanks to both of you for helping us to start the evening on the right note. Just a word briefly about the structure of our event this evening. We will start with Shabir Ali speaking for 20 minutes on the Qur'an and peace. Then we'll proceed with David Shenk speaking for 20 minutes on the Bible and peace. Each will then have the opportunity to respond to the other and ask a question. Then we'll take a short break, during which you'll have the opportunity to write on paper a question that is in your heart, in your mind, that you would like to explore in relation to the themes that are being raised tonight. Then we will pull ourselves back together and explore the questions together, and hopefully finish by 9:15. So without any further ado, I'd like to turn it over to our first presentation. Thank you.
Yes, do I use both? I mean, not this.
That should be sufficient.
Okay, sure. Just take this. Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming out on this cold, wintry night. I begin by praising our Creator and Fashioner and asking to send peace and blessings upon all of the prophets and messengers that He has sent over time. And I ask Him to bless all of you, all of us here tonight, and to help us to understand his scriptures and help us to understand how to live with each other as citizens of the world, as one global community in peace and harmony and in love. What does the Quran lay out as the foundation for peace? First, the Quran speaks about a universal God. And to me, this is a very important foundation for peace, because if we start wondering about and arguing over whose God is better than whose other God, then we are in conflict. But the idea of a universal God allows Muslims to say to anyone, you know you've been calling God by that other name? Well, you are referring to the same one God, because there is only one God. No matter what you call him, you are referring to the God that we believe in, the one creator, the fashioner, the sustainer of the entire universe. The Quran itself says that to God belongs the most beautiful names, so call him by whichever of these beautiful names you choose. The idea being you're still referring to the one God. Second, the Quran shows that we are all one humanity. The Quran gives us the story of Adam, which we all know from the book of Genesis. But the Quran has its own slant on these stories. The important point, however, being for our present moment, is that the Quran depicts Adam as the progenitor of all human beings. And the Quran refers to human beings as children of Adam. And so the fact that we are from this single origin means that we are all one humanity despite our differences, and that should bring us together and reduce conflicts. The sister referred to the 49th surah of the Quran, the 11th verse, which says that God has created you from a single male and female, and then made you into peoples and nations and tribes, so that you may get to know one another. That Muslim commentators on the Quran say that this obviously means that while you're trying to get to know each other, it should not be the opposite, that you are in conflict with each other. Elsewhere in the Quran, in the 30th chapter, God says that it is among the signs of his greatness that he has created you in such diverse ways, in such a diversity, made you into speaking many different languages and having different colors. All of this is from among the signs of the greatness of God and the marvel of his creative work. The third point I would like to put out as one of the foundations for peace in the Quran is that the Quran shows an openness to world religions. Now, this may come across as being a little bit strange given what we know about Muslim societies generally and about Muslim history. And I will try to elaborate on that a little briefly during this presentation, and perhaps more in depth in response to your questions later on. So what do I mean by this? The Quran shows us in the 5th chapter of the Quran, in the 48th verse, that God has created you such, and he has left you to your devices. If God had willed, he could have made you all one religion. But he has given to each person I have to use the Arabic terms here, a manhaj, which would mean a path to follow, and a sharia. We know sharia to be a word associated with Muslim law. But the Quran here is acknowledging that every people has a certain law. And had God wished otherwise, he would have made every people having the same one religion, the same manhaj, the same path to follow, the same sharia, but that was not his will. He's left it such so that he may test you and try you with regards to what he has given you. The idea being here that people have some code to follow, and they have their own moral conscience to guide them, and they will be held responsible before God for how they responded to the code that they had committed themselves to, and to the moral conscience that God has given them as a basic guide to distinguish between what is right and what is wrong. So the idea that there must be one religion for everyone is not something that is in fact supported by the Quran. Although, of course, to clarify that, I must add that the Quran does invite people to come to the religion of Islam. The Quran is a message, an open book, it says, for all humanity. The Quran says that God sent the Prophet Muhammad, on whom be peace, with this message to the entire world. so that whoever will hear this message, whether Jews or Christians or people of other faiths, and would turn to it, they would find salvation. This does not mean, however, that outside of the Islamic framework there is no salvation. Again, I must clarify this because there's a lot of misunderstanding surrounding this question. There is a verse in the Quran which says, "Inna dina inda Allahi al-Islam." The religion with God is only Islam. And some Muslims understand this in an exclusivist way, thinking that unless a person becomes a Muslim, that person could never find salvation. But I beg those Muslims to see the broader picture. The Quran describes God as Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim, the beneficent, the merciful one. And this is repeated in the Quran umpteen times, 114 times in the Quran. And in fact, more than this. The Quran describes God as beneficent and merciful. Now, if God is so beneficent and merciful, would he then leave the vast majority of human beings to go astray and end up in hell and be tortured forever? This does not fit with the general picture that we have of a merciful God. What then are we to say if we insist that only Muslims can go to paradise? It would mean that the vast majority of people who are not Muslims, obviously, will not go to paradise. Where then is the mercy of God? We must then rethink this whole question and understand that God has given every individual a set of options. There is a range of options. So I have a range of options. I can only see so far. Beyond that, see, there's the thought which has been thought, and the thought which could have been thought but wasn't thought. And then there's the thought that couldn't have been thought. You see? So we have a range of thought. For some people, becoming a Muslim is within the range of options. For some people, becoming a Muslim is not within the range of options. Some people may, given what they know about Islam already, may have their minds already so thoroughly made up that they could never be a Muslim, that even to broach the question of being a Muslim to them seems to be rather absurd. So people have a range of options. And then the question for you to answer before God, according to this explanation, would be, in what way did you respond to your range of options? Did you pick the good things from that range, or did you generally pick the bad things from within your certain range of options? To me, this is how God then distinguishes between good and bad people, and how he grants salvation to some and not to some others based on human choices within the ranges available to them. Given this broader view then, we can say that one of the Quranic foundations for peace is the idea of religious pluralism. People over history have fought, and they continue to fight over differences of religion. To this day, we have Sunnis bombing Shiis, and sometimes the other way around, whether it be in Pakistan or Afghanistan or somewhere else. People are quarreling over religion. And if we think back to the ages of the Inquisition and the witch hunts and so on, people are quarreling over who has the right religion, who has the right belief, and some people feel they have to eliminate the others. But the Quranic foundation for peace here is an acceptance of pluralism and a guarantee that when we go back to God, that is when all of the reality will be open before us, and the things we quarreled about and differed about here will now become clear to us in the next life. So things that cannot be settled in our dialogues and discussions will be settled when that reality opens before us. So I've traced, I think, 3 points so far. The oneness of God, the universality of God. Second, the oneness of humanity. And third, the plurality of religions. Now, the Quran as a message itself insists that peace is a very important component of its teachings. While the Quran is insisting on peace, the Quran also names God as As-Salam, the peace. The Quran invites people to go to paradise, and paradise is called in the Quran Dar as-Salam, the home of peace. So it means then that the utmost aspiration of a Muslim, whether it be to be with God, is for peace, or whether it be to be in paradise, that is the place of peace. We can understand then a popular Muslim prayer which includes the words, فَحَيِّنَا رَبَّنَا بِالسَّلَامِ, our Lord, cause us to live in peace. وَأَدْخِلْنَا الْجَنَّةَ دَارَ السَّلَامِ, and admit us into paradise, that place of peace. The Quran says, as-sulhu khayr, having a reconciliation. This is the best thing. The opposite of that, obviously, is corruption and anarchy, what the Quran calls fasad. Fasad. Upheaval. The opposite of peace. The Quran says again and again that God loves those people who are peaceful. He loves the muslihun, those who try to remedy situations and reduce conflict. And on the other hand, He does not like those people who cause fasad or corruption. If one were to read the second chapter of the Quran, one would see that very early in that chapter, God is blaming those who cause corruption. They say that they are peacemakers, نحن مصلحون, but on the other hand, ألا إنهم هم المفسدون ولكن لا يعلمون. Isn't it true that they are the ones who are truly the causes of corruption, but they do not acknowledge or do not feel or do not understand this point? So then the Quran condemns anarchy and the absence of peace, and on the other hand praises and insists on peace. Along these lines, we can understand then a previous comment that I made about the Quran's own view on biblical material. The Quran repeats the stories of many of the biblical prophets. And often we will find that some of the biblical prophets and heroes and special figures are involved in some violence. But the Quran's stories about these individuals do not involve the same violence, or so perhaps the violence is mentioned to a lesser degree. We have, for example, in the Genesis story, Abraham involving in some violence, not necessarily bad, to rescue his nephew Lut, or Lot. In the Quran, this is mentioned, the story of Abraham is mentioned, but his act of violence is not mentioned. The book of Genesis tells us that God promised some land to Abraham, and we know that to this day, conflict remains over this promise. What exactly is this promise? To whom does the land belong? And who's fighting for which piece of that land? In the Quran's depiction of the story of Abraham, there is no mention of a promise of land, and so this idea of the conflict does not ensue. The Quranic story of Moses mirrors many of the events which are mentioned in the books of Exodus to Deuteronomy. And yet, the Quran does not mention any of the violence that Moses was involved with according to some of these books. Although, of course, the drowning of the Pharaoh is mentioned in the Quran as well. But this is depicted both in the Bible and in the Quran as an act of God rather than an act of Moses or his troops. The story of Jesus is mentioned in the Quran. In fact, Jesus is mentioned by name 25 times. The third chapter of the Quran is called Ali Imran, the family of Imran, and Imran is depicted in the Quran as the grandfather of Jesus. The 19th chapter of the Quran is called Surat Maryam, the chapter of Mary, and that obviously is because the story of Mary and the birth of her child in that special way is depicted in this chapter. So many things are said about Jesus in the Quran. Many of his miracles are depicted. Jesus healed the blind, cured the leper, raised the dead, and so on. But nothing is mentioned by way of violence regarding Jesus in the Quran. And so what I find is that again and again the Quran is giving us the stories of the ancient prophets and heroes and wise men and women of the past, but giving us a highly spiritualized depiction of these personages. So the Quran is then deliberately, it seems to me, steering away from any depiction of violence. So far we have seen that we are talking about a universal God, about one humanity, about the pluralism in religion, the emphasis on peace, and, but the flip side of that, the condemnation of war or fasad or upheaval. And now, furthermore, the depiction of heroes and prophets and moral guides as upholders of peace. In the Quran, it is said that Jesus said, وَالسَّلَامُ عَلَيَّ يَوْمَ وَلِدْتُ وَيَوْمَ أَمُوتُ وَيَوْمَ أُبْعَثُ حَيًّا. Peace be upon me the day I was born, the day I die, and the day I am raised up alive. So the idea of peace is very prevalent here in the speech of Jesus as depicted in the Quran. More than this, the Quran insists that Muslims must live in peace with even their detractors and those who were opposed to them. And this requires some clarification. Because having come this far, we have to confront the fact that there are some Muslims who misuse certain verses of the Quran in order to justify their own violent programs. What we have to understand is that the Quran was revealed in a certain context. To understand the Quran, one must understand the context in which the Quran was revealed. Secondly, as with any book, one has to understand also the context of a certain part of the book. First of all, the book has to be interpreted in light of itself. And even more so, the book has a certain verse or part of the page has to be interpreted in the light of the rest of what is on that same page. Those who use the Quranic verses to justify their acts of violence do violence to both of these contexts. First, the historical, political context in which the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, lived and in which the Quran was first revealed. And second, they do violence to the text of the Quran by virtually, in effect, ripping the verses out of the pages and giving it the meaning that they want to give. For example, what do you think of the verse in the 9th chapter of the Quran, the 5th verse, which says, kill them wherever you find them? Well, this phrase from within that verse itself is what is most widely known about this verse. But when one considers the entire verse, and when one considers the page in which it was written, and when one considers the geographical, historical, political context in which this was revealed, a different picture emerges. First of all, it doesn't say point blank, kill them wherever you find them. It says when the sacred months are over. Now that takes us a longer discussion, and I don't have time now, but in the Q&A we can come back to this. That means that there are some times when it was prohibited for anyone to be attacked. The non-Muslims who were opposed to the religion of Islam and who were fighting the Muslims, trying to kill them by ambush and by whatever means, were given a reprieve of 4 months, according to what is written in the rest of this chapter, so that within 4 months they had a few options. They could cease their hostility, in which case they would be safe. They can leave the region, even if they remain hostile, and they would still be safe. Or, if they embrace the religion of Islam, that will be a sign that they have repented of their past actions, and then they will be safe. So if they cease their hostilities at least, they will be safe within these 4 months. They're called sacred months because the Muslims were to hold these months as sacred, which means that they were not allowed to attack anyone within these months, giving time and reprieve to the enemy, who were trying by all means to kill Muslims. Now, permission was given to the Muslims to defend themselves, but 4 months was allowed as a reprieve for the others to change their ways. So when it is seen within the verse itself as a whole, and when it is seen within the context of whatever else was written on that page, a different picture emerges. This is not a verse that calls on Muslims to kill non-Muslims, but it was a verse that spoke to a particular context of war and gave precise rules governing that situation. The context in which the Prophet Muhammad, on whom be peace, lived. I have to wrap this up very quickly now. The Prophet lived for 13 years in Mecca, his hometown, following his initial call to prophethood, and for 40 years before that. Now, within these years that he was living in Mecca, how many years did I say? 13? No, I'm wrong. 13 years. Now, for these 13 years, he and his followers were being persecuted. But he bore all of those persecutions, his followers bore them. Eventually he migrated, leaving this scene of violence, leaving them to live so that he could live. He went to another city called Medina. But even while he was trying to live peacefully in that city, the enemy armies came marching after him in one bout after another. First at the Battle of Uhud in the 2nd year after the migration. Then in the first the Battle of Badr, 2nd year. Then the Battle of Uhud, 3rd year. Then the Battle of the Trenches in the 5th year. This is called the Battle of the Trenches, also the Battle of the Allies, because such a large Allied force gathered against the Muslims that it was thought then that the Muslims would be decimated now once and forever. But the Muslims survived by digging trenches and holding off the enemy. And that was a peaceful end to what could have been a devastating battle. Then, in the 6th year, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, took his followers to go and make pilgrimage, but they were barred from entering that sacred city, Mecca, where Muslims go to make pilgrimage today. Muslims were enraged. How dare they prevent us from doing this sacred act? Islam is true. We should march in there and fight them. But the Prophet Muhammad on this occasion made a peace treaty with the enemy, called the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, in which the terms were balanced against the Muslims and in favor of the non-Muslims, but the Muslims endured all of this. Now when we understand this sequence of events, we can understand why the Quran eventually gives permission to the Muslims to fight back, because they were being oppressed. In the 22nd chapter of the Quran, in the 39th and 40th verses, the Quran says that permission is now given to Muslims to fight back, to defend themselves. And then in the 2nd chapter of the Quran, in the 190th verse, the Quran says that you are only to fight those who are attacking you, but you are not to be aggressors yourselves, because God does not like the aggressors. It is in this context of continuing events, then, I was mentioning the 6th year for that treaty, right? Eventually, it's in the 9th year that finally we get that verse which says that they have the 4 months to cease their hostilities, after which, as they have been attacking the Muslims, now the Muslims will be able to attack them as well. So they had better shape up or ship out. Either way, they would be safe. When we understand these contexts, then, we see that the foundations which the Quran has laid down for peace hold good, that God is a universal God, that humanity is all one, that God allows for religious pluralism, and finally, that the Quran insists on peace and condemns the opposite, and in doing so reshapes the stories of the biblical prophets and heroes to give that, to present them as excellent moral examples of striving for and working for peace. Thank you.
Thank you, Shabir. And now we'll hear for 20 minutes from David Shenk.
Thank you, Shabir. It brings back recollections of some very dynamic dialogues we had in the UK 12 years ago. And just so glad that we can join together in this event tonight. Looking at the biblical foundations for peace, we need to go back to the Garden of Eden itself, which you also went back to that event, where Adam and Eve were created as the parents of universal humanity. We all are one humanity, all one parent. And within that garden, God's plan was that Adam and Eve would live in fellowship with God and care for the garden and a life of peace. But alas, Adam and Eve turned away from God. They took the forbidden tree, the fruit from the forbidden tree, and declared their independence of God. They hide behind the bushes. God meets them there, and he describes for them what the consequences of this turning away from him are. And so there is a disease in the human family which has wended its way through our experience generation after generation, the disease of a spirit of rebellion against God expressed in so many ways. All of us in various ways participate with that reality and broken peace between ourselves and God. However, God enters the garden and meets Adam and Eve and promises that a son born to the woman will someday come who will crush the head of the evil one and who will be wounded in the battle, but he will overcome and triumph over this evil and this brokenness. And so from the dawn of human history, there is that promise of a son who will come and who will deal with evil and with brokenness which robs us of our peace. The prophets throughout the ages repeated that promise over and over again. Abraham is one of the first to whom God revealed that as he leaves the corruption of Babylonia, of the Iraqi area where he was living, of Tehran, and of that region, that he will, as he leaves that, God will bless him, and he will become a blessing to all nations. And so that promise is renewed again and again, that through the seed of Abraham, eventually a Savior will come. And so I've chosen this evening, rather than survey the biblical prophets and the various scriptures, such as the Torah, the Psalms, and so forth, to focus especially on this promised Messiah, Jesus the Christ, the Messiah, who is the fulfillment of this promise of peace to the world and peace to the nations. His birth was a surprise. The gospel describes his first bed as a manger in a cattle stall. He became a refugee in Egypt. In his youth and young adulthood, he worked as a carpenter. And at the age of 30 then, anointed with the Holy Spirit, he began his public ministry. He went to the synagogue in Nazareth, as was his practice, on the Sabbath day when he was ready to proclaim the inauguration of his mission. And they gave him a scroll to read from, and he read from the prophet Isaiah. The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to release the oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. And then he sat down and he preached his first sermon. It was one sentence long. He says, "Today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." Thus began the ministry of Jesus the Messiah. In all he said and did, he demonstrated that he is the fulfillment of God's reign of justice, righteousness, and peace on earth. His life and ministry were a revelation of the presence of the kingdom of God among us. All who were sick, crippled, blind, or deaf who came to him, he healed. He cast out demons. He fed the hungry miraculously, as when he broke 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, feeding 5,000 men plus women and children. He raised at least 2 people from the dead. He triumphed over creation, even walking on the water when it was necessary. The Messiah welcomed sinners, and he forgave sinners. And all those who were troubled, he welcomed them. He invited, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." The Messiah taught with authority and confronted injustice and religious hypocrisy. He proclaimed, "Woe to you, teachers of the law, you hypocrites! You clean the outside of the cup and dish, but inside they're full of greed and self-indulgence. Blind Pharisees," these were the religious leaders, "first clean the inside of the cup, and then the outside will be clean." In his Sermon on the Mount, the Messiah described the ethical foundations for the kingdom of God. Recall that God's blessing upon Abraham, recalling God's blessing upon Abraham, Jesus here describes the qualities that bring about authentic blessing. I won't read it all, but blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of God. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall be shown mercy. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Jesus also elaborated on sexual ethics, marriage, integrity, our attitude toward wealth and possessions, forgiveness of our enemies, reconciliation given to the poor, prayer and fasting, and not to worry. The people observed that he taught as one who had authority, not like their teachers. At the height of his popularity in Galilee, the Galileans attempted to make him become their king by force. At that time there was an insurgency in Galilee against the pagan Roman occupation. The plan of the Galileans was that Jesus would lead their underground army to victory. In Galilee, the Messiah could establish the kingdom of God and then extend its borders to the ends of the earth. He could feed the troops just by breaking bread and breaking fish miraculously. He could strike them blind and overcome this pagan, idolatrous army. Jesus, the Messiah, rejected that invitation forthrightly. Instead, he went into the mountains for prayer that night, and thereafter he resolutely set his face to go to Jerusalem, where he told his disciples they would arrest him, mock him, insult him, spit on him, and kill him. On the third day he would rise again. The disciples objected strongly. They believed that the Messiah could not be crucified. As Jesus approached the Mount of Olives east of Jerusalem, he mounted a colt. The children were jubilant and they sang, "Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord. Peace in heaven and glory in the highest." The children sang because they were acquainted with Zechariah's prophecy, a prophet who had written 500 years earlier, writing, "Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout, daughter of Jerusalem. See, your king comes to you, righteous and having salvation, gentle and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey." Surely the children knew this prophecy from Zechariah from their Sabbath school studies, and they were so thankful because they loved Jesus so much that in that colt ride he is declaring that indeed he is the Messiah. We read on Zechariah's prophecy. "I will take away the chariots from Ephraim and the war horses from Jerusalem, and the battle bow will be broken. He will proclaim peace to the nations. His rule will extend from sea to sea and from the river to the ends of the earth." His kingdom has nothing to do with military power. Zechariah proclaimed that the kingdom inaugurated by the Messiah would extend to all nations. It is a peace voluntarily received, never imposed on anyone. As Jesus came to the brow of the Mount of Olives on that donkey, he saw Jerusalem below him, and he started to weep, for Jerusalem would not receive the peace. The children singing, Jesus crying. He then descended the Mount of Olives and entered the temple with his army of singing children, and chased away the corrupt merchants who occupied the temple courts. The temple was the center of worship where Israel made regular pilgrimages. 18,000 priests and associates were required to keep the system working, and the whole religious enterprise had become a heavy burden. Jesus not only cleansed the temple in his commitment to justice and righteousness, but he also made it clear that the temple would one day be destroyed. That happened 30 years later. There was no need for a temple in the kingdom that he was inaugurating, for the people of God are the temple of God. The authorities were furious and planned his arrest. One of his disciples, Judas, turned traitor and decided to cooperate with the authorities. The night of his betrayal, Jesus had a Last Supper with his disciples. And at the supper, he made it clear that Judas would betray him. Then he got up from the table, took a basin of water and a towel, and proceeded to wash the feet of each disciple, beginning, it seems, with Judas. The Messiah washed the feet of his betrayer. Later that night, Jesus was in prayer on the Mount of Olives when Judas and the soldiers came to arrest him. One of his disciples took a sword and struck the arresting team struck one of the members of the arresting team, cutting off his ear. Jesus rebuked Peter, saying, "Put your sword back in its place, for all who draw the sword will die by the sword." Jesus touched and healed the stricken ear. Many accusations were hurled at Jesus in his trial. The charges about his cleansing of the temple and predicting its destruction were among the most damaging. He was condemned to be crucified. The Messiah said that he could muster an army of 72,000 angels to deliver him, but he would not. The next morning, Jesus was placed on a cross between two thieves. The Roman authorities put his inscription in 3 languages above his head: Jesus, the King of the Jews. People jeered, "If you are the King of the Jews, save yourself." And Jesus cried out, "Forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." Christians believe that in that cry of forgiveness, with hands outstretched, the soul of the kingdom of God is revealed. Outstretched hands seek to embrace In the crucifixion of the Messiah, Christians believe we experience the embrace of God, who invites all to come and participate in the forgiveness and reconciliation and peace of his kingdom. 3 days after his crucifixion, God raised the Messiah from the dead. In one of his resurrection appearances, he met the disciples and said, "Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, I am sending you. Receive the Holy Spirit." He commanded them to proclaim the forgiveness of sins to all people, and he commissioned them, "As the Father has sent me, I am sending you." 40 days after his resurrection, Jesus met his disciples on a hill in Galilee and commissioned them, "Go and make disciples of all nations." Then he ascended into heaven. As the astonished disciples were gazing into the heavens, 2 angels appeared to them and said, "This same Jesus who's been taken from you into heaven will come back in the same way you've seen him going into heaven." For the next 10 days, the disciples fasted and prayed in an upper room in Jerusalem. Then on Pentecost, when Israel celebrated the first fruits of the harvest, the Holy Spirit came upon the disciples. People representing every nation under heaven were in Jerusalem that day. Miraculously, as the apostles preached, they all heard the gospel in their mother tongues. That was a sign that God's kingdom of peace was coming upon all nations and languages. That is the birthday of the church. We have observed that the church was born within the context of Jesus the Messiah promising to return again. The mission of those who are committed to Jesus the Messiah is to continue living and proclaiming the kingdom that Jesus inaugurated in his first coming, and to continue living that kingdom until his second coming. It's for this reason that the faithful church around the world is often recognized as a community who encourages justice, peacemaking, schools, hospitals, agricultural development, cultural transformation in a humanizing direction, freedom and ministries of compassion, like Mother Teresa's nuns in Calcutta, who minister to the dying in their home for the aged and dying. I acknowledge in grief that the church has often betrayed its mission. Nevertheless, we give thanks for the many ways that the faithful church through the ages has been a sign of God's kingdom of justice, righteousness, and peace among the nations. God raised the Messiah from the dead. Likewise, God will raise all humanity from the dead in the final day when Jesus returns. At that time, everyone will face the judgment of God. The scriptures say, "And I saw the dead, great and small, standing before the throne, and books were opened. Another book was opened, which is the book of life. The dead were judged according to what they did, and as recorded in the books." And God proclaims, "Now the dwelling of God is with men and women, and he will live with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. Behold, I'm making all things new." Jesus often went into the hills for a night of prayer. So his disciples asked him to teach them to pray. The prayer he taught captures the essence of the messianic reign in biblical eschatology. This is the prayer Jesus taught. "Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread. Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For yours is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory forever." Yes, indeed, may we pray that God's kingdom will come in our very broken and wounded world.
I'd like to thank both of you for taking a very disciplined approach to the time parameters in your presentations. Now it's our opportunity for each of you to respond to the other. First Shabir Ali, and then David, will ask a question, and Shabir will ask a question.
working. Now, first, I must say that it is obvious from David's presentation that we are on the same page. We all desire peace, and we want to find any way possible to promote peace. And this is obviously commendable. We are all in this together. Second, I have heard David's story of Jesus many times, because he just reminded me we were in England together. We had a series of dialogues, and that was 12 years ago, you say? You have a better memory than I have.
I think so.
Yeah. And each time I hear David's story, it is a very moving story. Muslims, of course, believe in Jesus, and much of what he said corresponds to what Muslims believe as well. And I can see, obviously, many Christians are moved by this story, and you must have heard it many more times than I have heard it. It is a very emotional and moving story. So I love to hear you say that, David. Now, for our topic itself, what I've tried to do in my opening presentation is to show that there are certain Quranic foundations for peace. And I've tried to deal with the negative side of that. In other words, what might someone try to say if I make that rosy presentation about the Quran and its being a book of peace? And I've tried to respond to those. I haven't heard David do anything like that concerning the Bible, and probably he's hoping that I would raise some points and then he would come back and answer them. So let me raise some points if you don't mind. The first point I want to make is that it seems that David went from Genesis chapter 3 about the story in the garden, and then he went all the way to Jesus in the New Testament being the Messiah who will now crush the head of the serpent and usher peace into the world. But what about the rest of the Old Testament? How is God depicted in the Old Testament, and what kinds of laws does he give? Where does God stand with relation to peace and violence? I'd like David to comment on that particular situation, because we know that there are commandments in the book of Deuteronomy that call for the annihilation of certain peoples who do not believe in God within that harem that God has marked off as the land for his people. And the people were dealt with very brutally. When I went to Sunday school, we sang round and round the walls of Jericho. It's only in reading the Bible that we realize that after the walls came tumbling down, Joshua and his men went in and annihilated the people. So how does that fit in with the Bible as a book promoting peace? The second point I want to make is concerning Jesus. We know that there is one story about Jesus that David has told and has moved us all, but there are 4 Gospels. And nowadays, scholars are studying the Gospels in this university. I took some courses at this very university some decades ago. I won't tell you how many decades, but I can tell from my great beard. And the scholars are now examining each gospel to find out what is unique about each gospel and how do they present Jesus. And what is generally accepted today is that Mark was the first gospel of the 4 to be written, and John was the last. And if we look at the image of Jesus as he appears in the 4 gospels, we will see that the image has been reworked, almost like photoshopped over time, from one gospel to another. So whereas, for example, you find in the Gospel of Luke that Jesus healed the ear of that soldier whose ear was cut off by Peter, to many scholars, this is the reworking of the original story. Luke likes to make people look good. It doesn't look good if Peter cuts off the ear of that soldier, but Luke makes it look good now that the ear has now been healed. So if we look at the Gospels in this way, what is found more generally, and I'm going to step back for a moment, is that in the New Jerome Biblical Commentary it is mentioned that there were 3 kinds of messiahs expected according to the Dead Sea Scrolls. There was to be a priestly messiah, a king messiah, and a prophet messiah. Each of them could be called messiah, which just simply means anointed, one specially designated by God for divine service. So it could be a prophet, he could be a king, he could be a priest. The Gospels make him all 3 in varying degrees. But the idea that he was a king Messiah is also very prominent. And to me, David presented a lot about Jesus being peace, and that would be a priestly Messiah who has nothing to do with war. But kings do go to war. And the Gospels do present that element, that Jesus was a king Messiah. This is the whole point of the genealogies, to trace him back to David. He was to be the son of David, to represent David on the throne. Since David, Israel has not had a king. The Persians came in, the Babylonians came in, and eventually the Romans would destroy the temple. But even before the Romans could destroy the temple, the Jews were hoping for a son of David to come in and be king. And then, so we find this depiction of Jesus as the king of Israel. He has 12 disciples, and they are promised that they will sit on the 12 thrones, judging the kings of Israel. And then eventually, when Jesus is crucified, according to the Gospels, and David mentioned this, the charge against him was that he claimed to be king of the Jews. That was nailed to the cross along with him. So he was claiming to be a king. But of course, the Gospels reworked this. The Gospels want to deal with this. The Gospels were written at a time when the Christians were being persecuted. Christians might be hauled into the Roman courts. If they did not worship the Roman idols, they may have a limb cut off, an eye gouged out, or both eyes, or they might be thrown to the lions. This was not a good time for Christians to assert a militant stance against the Roman Empire. And so the Gospels were written with this in mind, and this has been mentioned by scholars such as Reuben Firestone. I'm not making this up. So we have to deal with this sort of information, and I'm sure that David has a good answer for all of this, and he will explain these points in some detail as much as the time will allow. The idea of the kingdom was that God's Sharia, or God's law, will be on earth. That's the whole idea of saying, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. We should have the law of God instituted on earth, and not Roman rule. That's what Christians were taught to pray for in this Lord's Prayer. But of course now the question arose, how can we have the kingdom? The kingdom is not here. Well, the kingdom is right here, already here, and that gets put back into the mouth of Jesus as the Gospels are retold from one to another, from Mark to Matthew and Luke, and then finally John. And so we have this in John's Gospel. Jesus is being asked directly by Pilate, are you a king? And then the answer is given so as to remove Jesus from the idea that he is here as a threat to Pilate. But we see inklings of this idea in many different ways. We see, for example, during the life story of Jesus, that Jesus sometimes used violence to bring about what he knew to be right. For example, when he cleansed the temple, as David mentioned, but the Gospels show that he did it with whips, with a whip of cords. He drove them out and overturned the tables. And then it is mentioned in Luke's Gospel in chapter 19, verse 27, that Jesus compared himself to a king who, when he returns, will say, where are those who didn't want me to roll over them? Bring them here and slay them before me. Now, it seems that this idea runs in more parts of the New Testament that you might imagine. In the Acts of the Apostles, it is said that when Jesus reappeared to his disciples, they said, but teacher, we thought that you're going to restore Israel. And he said, well, the time is not known to anyone. He's not denying that he's here for that purpose, but he is not giving any timeline within which it is going to happen. It comes to the book of Revelation to then depict Jesus in that role. Now when Jesus returns, he will wear a cloak which will be soaked with the blood of his enemies, and he will have a sword which comes out of his mouth. He will rule with an iron rod, according to the book of Revelation. So this seems to be an opposite picture. Now, I'm not saying this is a true picture of Jesus. This is one idea about Jesus. And I love to hear David's idea about Jesus. That is more in line with what Muslims think Jesus must have been. But at the same time, when we enter into dialogue like tonight's dialogue, we have to deal with both the positive and the negative. Unfortunately, negatives are there. We have to deal with them. When I explain the Qur'an, even a Muslim will stand up and say, right from the midst of the room, hey, you're not representing the Qur'an, because look, the Qur'an says that we have to be violent, and we have to go kill the enemy and take over the world. Somebody may say that, and then I have to deal with that. I have to answer him from the Qur'an itself and show him where he's mistaken, where he's misunderstood the Qur'an. In a similar way, there are things in both the Old and the New Testament which will seem to count against the idea that the Bible is really a book that could promote peace in our modern world. And those negatives have to be dealt with as well. And I'm sure that David is ready to deal with all of this, and I'll enjoy listening to his answers. Thank you very much.
That was intended to be a joke, I take it.
No.
That I'll answer all these questions.
Oh, no. No, it's not a joke, but within the time, I'm sure you'll deal with them briefly.
With all of them?
Okay, whatever you can. And tomorrow after dinner for the rest.
Dinner, yes, well, let's get tomorrow.
How about your part of the story? Why you don't answer to his questions? Why you made it questions about the Bible as a question about the Quran?
Okay, well, yeah, good. I would like first to go in a little different direction and then address some of the issues that you have raised. I have talked about the church being committed to Christ, crucified and risen, and what that means as a community of ministry and healing among the nations. That's God's call upon us to live in that way. Some years ago, I was in Germany for a dialogical colloquium. It was a theological reflection, and I made a presentation similar to what I made tonight. There was a Muslim theologian and myself, and we would each take turns making presentations. Then the theologians would discuss the implications of what we're talking about. And when I concluded my presentation, the Muslim theologian stood up and with anger said, "This is the first time I have known that the cross of Jesus Christ has anything to do with forgiving enemies. I have thought that the cross of Jesus Christ is about killing the enemies, and especially killing Muslims." And she was angry. I just wept. I wept because, for many reasons, I wept. But at that very time, the war was going on in Kosovo, where allegedly Christian armies of militia were going through Kosovo and killing Muslims in their villages and burning their houses and planting crosses in the ashes. And I just said, may God forgive the church. In the 4th century, a horrible turn took place when Constantine painted the cross on the shields of his soldiers and went into war. He was victorious under that cross. And so you then fast forward, you come to the Crusades, then you fast forward and you come into simply our current situation, where so often the Christian communities who claim to be committed to Christ are involved in violence and in destruction. And I just said to her, I hope you can forgive us, and may God forgive us. She then said later on that confession of the sins of the church had opened her eyes to a Jesus she never knew was there. And so when, as Christians, we talk about the peace of the gospel, we do so with deep gratitude, for this is a precious gift of grace, we believe, but also we need to walk with repentance, for so often the church has distorted that peace of Christ. And this also then comes to the question that you raised in regards to the violence in some portions of the Old Testament. In our communities, our church communities, we often speak about looking at the Bible through what we call a Christ-centered hermeneutic, looking at Jesus as the center, and Jesus has commanded that we should do so. On the Mount of Transfiguration, he is there with Elijah and with Moses, and then the great prophet of the law, who summarizes all the, metaphorically, the prophetic movements having to do with law and so forth, and Elijah the prophetic movements having to do with miracles and confrontation with evil powers and so forth. And both those prophets are there, and then they step aside, the cloud picks them out of view, and only Jesus is there with a voice from heaven saying, obey him, hear him. Which is to say that the prophets are very important of the Old Testament, but Jesus is the way in which we interpret them. Moses doesn't have the last word, Jesus does. And so when we look at the violence of the Old Testament, we're troubled often by that. But also sense that it is a story, an account, a narrative of God working with the people, transforming them, and helping them to move forwards towards a reign of peace. All of the messianic prophets in the prophecies in the Old Testament are looking forward to a reign of peace, which Jesus fulfilled. So it seems to me also that within the Muslim movement, we could use more help in understanding how Muslims interpret the sword verses. You were helpful tonight in that. But if we had more time, it would be very helpful to hear more about that. How Muslims work at the violent edge of the Qur'an, which catches all of us around the world. Wherever I travel around the world, the question comes up everywhere I go. What about the violent edge of the Qur'an, which, as you were pointing out, there are groups, jihadist groups, who embrace interpretations of those violent verses, which bring much grief and are troubling. How do you work at that exegetically and homiletically? It would be helpful to hear more about that, it seems to me. And also, what about the global situation in which we live now? Both the Christian world and the Muslim world are in many ways caught in cycles of violence right now while we're sitting here tonight. How do we as Christians address that as a people committed to biblical faith? And how do Muslims address the violence which is so much prevalent in our world today? A common word, a letter written by the Muslim world to the Christian world, back there like almost 8 years ago, says Christians and Muslims have a special responsibility for peacemaking. How do we work at that special responsibility with over half of the world's population being Muslim or Christian? And at the edges so often these conflictual situations. Thank God there's many places where there is peace and good movement forward, and we could spend more time on that tonight. But there's many places where there's much to be desired. How much?
You have 2 minutes.
Okay, yes. Let me just say a word about the Revelation passages and the violence, the violent images that come through there sometimes. It's very interesting that the Lamb, who is the resurrected Jesus, overcomes his enemies with the sword that comes from his mouth. This is not the sword that you wield and chop off people's heads with. It's the sword that comes from his mouth. It is the word of truth with which he triumphs over his enemies. And his garment, dipped in blood, is his own precious blood shed on Calvary. That he is the one who is bringing about victory of evil, of good, of righteousness, of peace over evil, at great cost. At great cost. The cost revealed in what happened on the cross. There is, of course, an interplay within the biblical accounts, the New Testament accounts, as well as the Old Testament accounts, but especially the New Testament account, between the wrath of the Lamb, the justice of the Lamb, and his needed to express his wrath from time to time as he brings about justice, and the Lamb on the cross forgiving the enemies. And that's a dilemma that we live with. The wrath of the Lamb and the forgiveness of the Lamb. And so those are the interplay that we need to work with as we look at the New Testament. Thank you.
Would each of you like to ask each other one more question now, or wait until after our refreshment break?
No.
Yeah, all right. So, I think since we'll reverse the order. Sure. Dave,
Okay.
would you like to ask the first question? and then
This is my question, you know. And it might be helpful in relation to the question just raised. How do you exegete the Qur'an? You helped somewhat tonight, but there's a lot of questions around the edge. And I travel the world, and everywhere I go, this question is asked. I mean, what about this militant edge within Islam? The Cain and Abel story in the account in the Qur'an, as I understand it, if I'm getting it wrong, help me know. As I understand it, within the Qur'an, Cain is coming to get Abel, going to kill him. And Abel says to God, I'd rather die than use a weapon to defend myself against my brother. And God says, Abel has chosen the better way. And so Abel is killed by his brother without using the sword to defend himself. Do I have this story right?
Okay. Similar.
Yeah. Now, people like Ramasana and so forth talk about a pacifist stream within Islam. I'm just wondering, as you work at the issues of violence within Islam, is there some help within that Cain and Abel story that you would that could help? That would be helpful. I mean, where does the Cain and Abel story fit in as you look at the issues of violence in our world today? Or doesn't it fit in?
Yeah, certainly that Cain and Abel story fits in because Cain wanted to kill Abel, and Abel said, rather than me being blamed for killing my brother, I would rather it be the other way, and you will take upon yourself my sin and your own sin. The idea being here that if one wrongs another, he has to compensate for that wrong on the Day of Judgment. And Muslims are taught, even if you say a bad word about somebody, then on the Day of Judgment, you might have to pay that person back, and you have to pay him in terms of good deeds. So Muslims accumulate good deeds. As people say, they accumulate karma. Well, Muslims accumulate good deeds, and it may so happen that you have to pay back their good deeds to the people whom they have harmed in some way. And so we understand Jesus is saying that if you have wronged somebody, then before you take your gift to the altar, go and seek that person's forgiveness, and then go make right with God. So Muslims are told to make right with people. Definitely that Abel story helps us to see that Muslims can work for peace and live for peace, and Abel showed us a good example of doing precisely that. Now, the verse I mentioned in my opening presentation is what David is referring to as the sword verse. This is how Muslim commentators had called that verse. And Muslim commentators had generally said that the sword verse abrogates, in a way cancels or repeals, those verses of the Qur'an which called on Muslims to live in peace and harmony with those who were attacking and opposed to them. However, many modern commentators now think that the idea of abrogation, what is called naskh in Arabic, has been overplayed, and we should more think of it in terms of takhsis or specification, in that verses are related to special circumstances. And one verse might relate to a certain circumstance, another verse to another circumstance, and we shouldn't confuse the two. In that case, we understand that the sword verse relates to a particular situation in which Muslims are besieged and they have to defend themselves or be decimated. So a verse like the sword verse comes into play. In all other situations, all of the other teachings of the Quran hold sway, like Surah 109, which says, "Lakum dinukum waliya din." You have your religion, I have mine. To such commentators like myself, a verse like this is not cancelled forever. Nobody can cancel the word of God. It holds, and it holds for those situations which do not call for some special operation, like the sword verse calls for when Muslims are being besieged and they need to defend themselves. So no verse is cancelled then, and the overwhelming teaching of the Quran then is like the Surah 109. A further point very quickly within my 3 minutes is that Surah 109 is a Meccan verse. What is called the sword verse is a Medinan verse. And we should understand that the Meccan verses do not relate to any situation. They are general. And that shows the underlying and basic default position of Islam before any special consideration or any special circumstance comes to impose themselves on the Muslim community. So the basic presupposition of Muslims is that they will live in peace as depicted in Surah 109 and in the Meccan verses more generally. Thank you. Question for David. You mentioned in your response, David, that the violence that is depicted in the Old Testament are narratives. They just narrate what has happened. But in my recollection, there are also commandments of God that tell people, like for example in Deuteronomy 20 and Deuteronomy 13, that actually say that you go into this territory and you kill everything that breathes. So how do you reconcile the idea that the God of the Old Testament is giving this kind of commandment to decimate and annihilate the enemy, and the God of the New Testament is saying that you should live in peace and love everyone? Marcion's response was to say that the God of the Old Testament is a false God, and so he rejected the entire Old Testament. But that's not what Christians generally do. Christians try in some way to reconcile the entire Bible, and you say that you do that from a Jesus-centric or a Christ-centric point of interpretation. And you say it in your own terminology a better way than I can say it. But the point still remains that if this is the same God throughout, how does he so reverse the order of things that he stands for violence and eliminating the enemy on the one hand, and on the other hand for loving the enemy? Please.
In 3 minutes, I can answer that?
Whatever time the organizers will allow.
You know, there's a
Or tomorrow oxygen, it is all.
Mennonites are having a conference on Joshua shortly. Mennonite scholars.
It just happened.
What's that?
It just happened.
Oh, it just happened. Oh, we should have them report what they decided. Why Joshua? Because in Joshua there is a lot of that sort of thing, you know. And how do we interpret Joshua in the light of Jesus? That's the question. I confess, for me, it's a perplexity. I live with a perplexity about that. You talked about Moses. It is interesting when Moses saw an Egyptian slave master beating an Israeli, he killed the slave master. And then he had to escape for his life and go out into the boondocks for 40 years and learned in that experience that that's not God's way of resolving the problem of a slave master, and reveals to Moses, retribution is mine. It's my responsibility to exercise justice in those sorts of situations, and not yours to go and use the instruments of violence to do it. And so when Moses returned then, it was God who intervened and who brought judgment upon the Egyptians. He did not lead an army. Moses did not lead an army to break loose from the shackles of oppression under Pharaoh. It was God's miraculous intervention. So there you see in that primal narrative, there is a revelation of God's plan. I know you get to Deuteronomy, you get to Leviticus, and on to Joshua and so forth, where there is these genocidal wars, which make me wince. And I'm not sure how to put all that together theologically. But I do know one thing, that the prophecies about the coming of the Messianic reign, all of them, see this Messianic reign as being a reign of peace. And that's what Jesus was about. That even David, man after God's own heart, when he wanted to build the temple, God says, you can't build the temple, David, because you're a man of war. There's blood on your hands. He couldn't build the temple, you see. And so God's grand plan is clear through all of those Old Testament passages, is towards a day when God's peace will be established, and Zechariah prophecy that we read tonight. I will do away with the weapons of war, and certainly the people of God who seek to walk in accordance with this kingdom that God has promised and that the Messiah has brought about need to be a people who walk in step with his calling. Now, of course, we live in a fallen world, and our nations go to war and so forth. We struggle with how we live within those two kingdoms. As Anabaptist Mennonites, we generally say the church is the church and the state is the state, and we seek not to compromise those two. Others work at it another way. So you have put your finger on a very challenging question. Thank you.
He's going to be sharing your questions with our guests. Dr. Lowen has been working among peoples of Afghanistan and Iran since 1981. Currently residing in Manitoba, he travels to Afghanistan to present leadership seminars at the University of Kabul, as well as other institutions and NGOs. He's a specialist in Persian culture, having earned an MA in Persian in Pakistan and a PhD in Toronto, Canada. So thank you for helping us out, Arlie. We will now proceed with the questions.
Good evening. I've learned a lot this evening already from Shabir and from David. And we have a lot of questions here. Some of them will test my literacy skills, but we'll proceed with them, and we will try to be disciplined with our time. I've even got a stopwatch here. See if I can get that lined up here. The first question is a general question addressed to both Shabir and David. And what I've done I've collapsed some questions because they're similar, so I'll put them together so we don't repeat ourselves. What is the purpose of an event that only helps to polarize? That's the first question, and related to that is when relations between followers of two different religions are tense, is it appropriate to ask provocative questions about the other side's sacred scripture? Or would it be better to simply focus on what each person knows best, his own religion and its teachings? And then another one related to that. What kind of gestures and statements do Muslims and Christians most want to see and hear from each other? Is that too many in one? So, why focus on the other's scripture? Because it tends to be provocative and polarized. And what would you like to see from the other religion and hear from each other? Do you want to start?
Sure.
And then David.
Yeah, okay. We have 2 minutes.
We'll go for 3.
3? Okay. First, what do we want to know about the other scriptures? Well, there's only so little I know about the Bible, and I would like to know more about the Bible's history, its formation. But when Muslims think of the Qur'an, they think of the Qur'an as the Word of God. And often they have questions about the Bible. In what way would we say that the Bible is the Word of God? I'd like to know more about that. Muslims want to know more about Jesus and his teachings. The Quran, though it mentions Jesus many times, is only brief and elusive with the biblical stories in general. So Muslims naturally would want to know more about Jesus, where he was born, where he lived, and so on. About the prophets in general, when the Quran refers to the great biblical prophets, the Quran refers to them and to their stories as though the stories are already known. So the Quran does not repeat the entire story, but only looks at particular points in the story to bring out a moral lesson. Naturally, Muslims are curious to know more about these biblical stories. Now, the other side of the question is why refer to the other scriptures when obviously we are only experts on our own. In fact, I don't even consider myself to be an expert in my own scriptures, much less so in trying to speak about other scriptures such as the Bible. So why refer to things that we don't know so much about in the first place? Partly because when we get into a dialogue like this, there's an opportunity for learning, and we only learn by introducing questions. Muslim scholars say that the question is the starting point for learning. If we come with questions and we go away with the same questions, then we haven't really learned much, though we have talked a lot. So it's important that we do raise questions. In dialogues like this as well, there could be many ways of conducting such dialogues. There are dialogues in which people come together, they pat each other on the back, they say, I'm okay, you're okay, everybody's okay, let's be happy and let's go home. Some people are happy doing it that way. On the other extreme, you have people at each other's necks, they're arguing, they're really fighting with each other with words, and that obviously is not conducive to any progress of any kind. It's destructive, and I wouldn't engage in that sort of dialogue. In between these two extremes, sometimes people call for a sort of engagement which is frank and open, and says, let's talk respectfully to each other, but let's raise important and real questions that's on our minds. And let's, by this interaction, bring two sides to the story. This is the motto of every journalism piece in modern times. They want to hear the two sides of the story, but let's hear it in a frank and open, honest, and respectful manner. I think we've tried to do that tonight.
Thank you. David, can you respond to that question?
Yes. A dialogue like we had tonight, I came into it and come into it with a great deal of interest because of a deep and sincere desire to understand what the Qur'an does say and teach about peacemaking. What is its peacemaking message? And I've worked and lived with Muslims for many years, and that's an ongoing quest on my part. Both Muslims and Christians are committed to books of Revelation, which form who we are and our faith and practice. And if we're going to work together, we need to understand one another. And I have, like tonight, there's some insights you brought in regards to Quranic revelation and so forth that I wasn't aware of, as I should have been, and I just find that very, very helpful. There's, of course, on the Muslim side and on the Christian side, a witnessing dimension of the conversation that both of us are deeply committed to our scriptures, and we seek to explain the scriptures to those who aren't in touch with our respective scriptures. I experience that whenever I am with Muslims, and I trust they experience that with me as well. It's trust building.
Okay, Shabir, perhaps because of the audience, a majority being Christian, a lot of questions are related to you. And I'll read a few questions that I feel are somewhat related. It has to do with conversion. This one is actually for both. How do you make peace with those people of your faith, Muslim or Christian, who choose another religion, Muslim to become Christian and Christian to become Muslim? And related to this, if a man born in a Muslim family arrives at the age of 18 and wants to change their religion, what does the Sharia law say about this? And then there's others as well that have to do with the conversion from one religion to the other, and why are there Christians in prison if Islam is a religion of peace? How can you say that Islam is peaceful if we see Christians in prison in some of these countries? So if you could respond to those questions, and David also just briefly on, because this one is asking for both.
Sure. In the classical Muslim tradition, it was widely accepted that apostates should be put to death. Some scholars made exceptions for women, and that the Hanafi scholars, for example, said that though the men might be or should be killed, not so women. And that shows that there is not, this difference of opinion among great classical scholars shows that there is no clear injunction, either in the Quran or accredited to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, in an authentic saying of his that would lead to the conclusion that the apostate must be put to death. So how did that become such a widespread belief among Muslims? There is a hadith that says, a hadith is something outside of the Quran, it is a snippet of information usually attributed to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, reporting on something he said or did, or something that he might have acquiesced in, or thought to have acquiesced in. The report says that he said if one changes his religion, you should kill him. But the wording, now a response from myself and some others who are looking into this in our present context and find it abhorrent that you're killing a person because he changes his faith, what we would do is we would say that this hadith it cannot be taken or it cannot be concluded from this hadith that the apostate should be killed, because this hadith is quite general. If any person, whether a person reneges from Islam or reneges from another faith, would fit this description if a person changes his religion. We would look at the other part of the hadith which says, and he leaves his community, he abandons his community. And what this seems to imply is that in the time when, if this was actually said by the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, to begin with, it would mean that at the time when every man was a soldier at war, could be called at any time to defend the Muslim populace, he then knew the secrets of the Muslim military because he was potentially or actually a soldier at war. In that case, if he joins the enemy, it will be like today's equivalent of one of our army personnel having beer with a soldier from the other side, from one of our enemy armies. That would not be acceptable. He might be charged with treason. And of course, in ancient times, people were treated very harshly for things like treason. But looking more broadly, we would say that the Qur'an shows that there should be no compulsion in religion. The second chapter of the Qur'an, in the 256th verse, says, La ikraha fid din. And the wording is put such in Arabic that it negates in an absolute way. There is no compulsion in religion. This means absolutely no compulsion. And naturally, if you kill a person for leaving the religion of Islam or any religion, that means you're compelling him to stay in the faith. And you're going against this verse of the Quran. In fact, some classical scholars were aware that they're going against this verse of the Quran, but they said the verse is abrogated. But we would say the verse is not abrogated, it still holds, and you cannot force a person to stay in the faith. Anyone is free to stay or leave.
Okay, David, can you just respond? And the one question wasn't answered, but...
Sure. Yes. I'm with a member of the Mennonite Church, and some in this audience, many perhaps are part of that tradition, which grew out of the Anabaptist movement in 16th century Europe. And one of the convictions of that group of Christians, as they studied the New Testament, is that people should be completely free to choose their faith. And that when you practice infant baptism, that means that the person is brought into the faith without having chosen. And so that's why the Anabaptists baptized adults. In fact, in Europe in the 16th century, that was considered treasonous. And so many of our spiritual ancestors were actually martyred for that commitment to baptizing adults. But that commitment continues to live with us within the free church tradition, that people are given freedom by God to choose the faith or to reject the faith. And we need to respect that freedom, and baptism is a sign of that respect. We baptize adults, we don't baptize children. Now, in churches that do baptize children also do have a confirmation service when they're about 12 or 13, when they need to declare. So even when children are baptized as infants, there is that declaration event where children are free to choose, and the church and the community respects that. That's a deep conviction of ours, and there's no compulsion in religion. It seems to me that that is an area where Muslims who believe and want to commit themselves to that commitment, and we Anabaptists could really stand together in the insistence that people are free to choose. God gives them that freedom. We do not have the authority to abrogate that freedom.
Okay, in light of that, I want to just reiterate this question then. What you have shared about religious pluralism, and there's no compulsion in religion. I see in countries like Iran, Iraq, and Turkey, there's Christians that are in jail. So can you comment on that present situation where doesn't seem there, or there isn't the religious pluralism? And related to that, if Islam is a religion of pluralism, why then sharing the Christian faith is prohibited and punishable in many Islamic countries? So could you respond to that?
I believe that everyone should have the freedom to choose a faith and to share that faith with others. And the fact that a person has chosen a different faith or a particular faith should not be reason for imprisoning that person, and people should not be prohibited in any country, whether Muslim or otherwise, from sharing their inner convictions, so long as they're not harming anybody else by sharing those convictions. So we have the principle of non-harm even in Canada. You cannot share something that will be of harm to other people. But no harm comes from sharing the Christian gospel or sharing the Muslim belief in Muslim theology and scripture, or many of the world's religions for that matter. In fact, I don't know any of the world's religions that could be considered harmful. And so for this reason, I don't see any reason for Muslims to prohibit others from preaching their faith in Muslim lands. In fact, I believe that Muslims should have the confidence that their own faith is secure, that what they believe in is on a firm foundation, and that belief is not threatened by any other contrary message. It so happens, however, that in many Muslim societies, thinking has become stultified. Illiteracy is very low, and the way of envisioning our own religion is one of just simply rote memorization and ritual practice. And Muslims have lost the art of debating, of philosophizing, of thinking deeply about things that classical scholars named as kalam. When they engaged in dialectic theology, they wanted to get to the root of things and understand why. How did the universe come into existence? What does God mean for the universe, and so on? There are many historical reasons for this, but many Muslim societies have come now to just simply accept the Islamic faith as it is without thinking of the how and why, and many become threatened if they hear a different message. They feel that this is foreign. Rather than to engage with it in a meaningful way, the best way is just simply to stamp it out, prohibit it from being heard. But of course, questions are such that once the question is raised, you need to know the answer for it. So it's not enough for Muslims to just prohibit others from preaching their messages in Muslim lands. Muslims need, in Muslim lands, to reinvigorate the spirit of dialogue, of openness, of communication, and debate, so we can get to the bottom of questions. If what you have is true, let's accept that. If what I have is true, let's accept that. And may the best arguments guide us to what is true, as we might do in a courtroom where you have a prosecution and you have a defense. And it's only by hearing both sides that at the end you can decide what exactly is the truth of the matter. And still at the end, sometimes we don't know, but at least we're better informed, we hope. So that was what the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, did, and that's what the Qur'an does. The Qur'an repeats the accusations and the claims of the enemies and then replies to them. And Muslims should have the same spirit as the Prophet Muhammad and as the Qur'an.
I'd just like to comment on that. That's very helpful. And it seems to me that people like you and those of us who are committed to nurturing religious freedom should find ways to cooperate together in helping to communicate that message. I travel a lot. I get into quite a number of situations where I'm involved in dialogue with Muslim leaders and theologians and so forth. And I think that this is probably the most pertinent and challenging issue that we face, because many theologians don't agree with you, on this point. And for Muslims who take the Quranic injunction, no compulsion religion, seriously, and are ready to speak to decision makers and so forth about that, and thus some of those Christians who are committed to the same vision, to work together and helping to awaken conscience and commitment to giving people space to freedom, I think is very, very important. And sometimes, and it can be, I don't want to overstate it, but for example, as Kosovo was beginning to work on their constitution for an independent Kosovo, they invited me to come to the university and speak on this very issue. And the writers of the Constitution were participants in that forum. They had never heard such ideas before, that people should be free to choose their religion. At least that's what they told me. And so a lot of foment went on, but all the writers of the Constitution were in that university event, And you look at the Constitution for Independent Kosovo today, it says we assure religious freedom, you see. So we need to be engaged, I think, energetically in these kinds of issues, joining hands wherever we can together to assure that people are free to embrace faith they choose. God gives them that freedom. We are not authorized to rob people of that freedom.
Do you want to respond to that? Or?
I mean to say yes, I agree. We should work together, people of like minds, to bring this into a reality, to make this voice heard as loudly and clearly and as widely as possible.
All right, here's a question for David. David, will you lead an apology on behalf of the church to the descendants of African slaves since the church supported slavery?
You know, this needs to happen. It needs to happen.
Could you read the question again, please?
Yes.
Okay, the question is that could David lead an apology on behalf of the church to the descendants of African slaves because the church historically supported slavery? Is that the question? You understand the question?
Yes. No, it really needs to happen. And Jonathan was sharing a story just today about working there in Senegal, which was the center of the slave trade, and the tremendous pain that all of that still brings into the situation today. That should certainly happen. I don't think I have the energy to give leadership to it, but I will certainly be the first to step forward and join whoever gives leadership to this and do all I can for it to happen. Thank you, whoever wrote that. Let the writer of the question give leadership to it, and we'll fall in line and do all we can to speak to this awful, awful tragedy.
I would encourage the writer of this question to talk with Jonathan, who shared that story this morning of between Muslims and Christians in Senegal. That was very moving. Shabir, could you comment on the Quranic idea of jihad as a personal and global responsibility for Muslims?
The word jihad is a verbal noun in Arabic, and it means striving. This word is used many times in the Quran, and it has a very broad meaning. As I said, striving, basically, it could be striving to eradicate evil from society, using one's voice to speak against it, or is striving to eradicate evil in oneself by becoming more spiritual, by getting closer to God. It can take the form of, let's say, getting up early in the morning to offer prayers to God. That's called a striving, or effort, basically. It could also take on a military tone if the situation so calls for it. There is another word in the Quran which relates to fighting specifically. That word is qital. But it so happens that if somebody wants to further his particular mission of evoking a call for violence, instead of using the word which normally means violence and which many Muslims abhor, he uses the word jihad, which is close to the thinking of many Muslims, because for many Muslims, that's what we do. We're struggling all of the time. We're struggling to eradicate evil in ourselves and in our society. So there's a call for jihad that seems like it's calling to us. So this is a misuse of the Quran, because the word jihad by itself does not have to mean military confrontation. It can mean in a particular context. But the Quran spells out how one can actually engage in a military confrontation with others and for what purposes. In Surah 4, verse number 75, the Quran asks Muslims, why do you not respond to the call of those oppressed and weak women and children who are calling out, God, send us a help from any quarter, who will rescue us from these oppressors above us? So the Quran now gives a justification for war, that Muslims can defend these weak and oppressed people from their oppressors. Now, of course, if one is committed to pacifism, then one might find even this objectionable. But if one is a practical pacifist and thinking that, yes, we're generally pacifists and that we would not engage in war unnecessarily, but we can come to the defense of the weak and needy and oppressed people, well then someone might find that, okay, this makes sense. The other justification for engaging in a military confrontation is mentioned in the Quran in Surah 22, verses 39 and 40. It says that permission is given to those who are oppressed so that they can now respond militarily. And had it not been for the fact that God gave such permission, then the churches, the mosques, and the synagogues, and the monasteries in which the name of God is being recited much would have been demolished. So this obviously speaks to the permission for Muslims and others to defend their places of worship, more so for Muslims in particular, to defend every place of worship against aggressors who would try to demolish these places of worship. So guarding the oppressed, or coming to the aid of the oppressed, and removing religious persecution, these are the two justifications that the Quran gives for engaging in a military confrontation. But then that would be called qital, not necessarily jihad.
Okay, so that,
May I make a comment?
I just want to emphasize, or just reiterate, is this then takatalu fi sabiullah? Is that what the question is? I would like to hear your thoughts on the famous verse of the Quran, takatalu fi sabiullah. Is that what you were referring to? Or I'm not sure where that was.
This question is using the other word, qital, which I mentioned, and the questioner is not necessarily quoting the Quran verbatim,
Okay.
but it's referring to a Quranic idea. Al-qital fi sabilillah is mentioned in the Quran more than once, yes. Fighting in the way of God, it will be for these two justifications, either for defending the oppressed or for preserving religious freedom.
You had a response?
Well, I was just going to say that it seems to be an example that would be in India some years ago when that awful conflagration took place because of that the temple situation, dedicated to Rama, and how that Muslims would stand around Hindu places of worship to prevent mobs from attacking them, and Hindus would stand around Muslim places of worship to prevent mobs from attacking them. The both communities standing in the breach, as it were, and trying to protect the worship places of the alternative communities was a wonderful example, I think, of what you're talking about.
Okay, here we have a generic question. I am an old woman and long for peace. The world has so much hate and violence, so much brokenness. From both men, I would like to know, how does one know if they will be able to enter this house of peace or heaven? Can you respond? And then
in our broken world, you know. Well, I believe that Jesus is the way, and that He is the door into the kingdom, and that as we commit ourselves to Him, we are participants. We become participants in His eternal kingdom of peace, which is both happening now and eternally.
Okay.
In the Islamic tradition, this is not given to us as something that we can know or that is desirable to know. Let me think about the desirable part. If one feels I have the ticket to heaven, then that seems to mean you do whatever you want and you're going to heaven anyhow. But the Muslim thinks that the entire life is a test from God, and we have to continue passing our test. That does not mean that we cannot fail at times, but generally we should be passing. Or when we fail, we're able to pick up ourselves again and go back on that road. So we might deviate from times, but we keep going back. For Muslims, this is illustrated in the story of Adam, which is told in the Quran with a different twist. In the Quran, we have that Adam did slip, and yes, he fell. He ate from the forbidden tree. But then God taught him the prayer which he should recite to seek forgiveness from God, because he was already feeling penitent. He wants to know what to say. So God tells him, okay, these are the words. And Muslims to this day recite the very words, which might translate to something like this. Our Lord, surely we have wronged our souls, and if you do not forgive us and have mercy on us, then we are lost. Muslims, by reciting this prayer, feel that this is the way forward. We might make mistakes. God does not expect us to be perfect, because after all, He created us. He knows our weaknesses. He knows that we'll fall from time to time. But what He's looking for is whether or not we will, after having fallen, pick up ourselves and go back on the right track. So how does a Muslim try to maintain the right track? First, two things are mentioned in the Quran repeatedly, by having the right belief and the right practice. In terms of the right belief, Muslims hold to basically 6 principles of right belief. 1 is belief in God, 2 belief in his angels, 3 in his books, 4 in his prophets, 5 in the idea that God foreknows and he determines all affairs, and 6 in life after death and accountability for the life that we have lived in this life, in this world. And so much for the right belief. And in terms of right practice, Muslims hold to 5 essential things which are referred to as the pillars of Islam, as is described in any introductory book on Islam. First, the open declaration of one's faith, or at least the verbalizing of that faith, what's referred to as the Shahada, bearing witness that there is no God but God, and that Muhammad is the messenger of God. Second, offering regular prayer. Third, giving charity. Fourth, fasting, especially during the month of Ramadan. And fifth, making a pilgrimage to the sacred mosque in Mecca.
David, can you please comment or clarify? Most Anabaptist Christians have a very different view of Scripture versus the Quran. Example, the Bible is not a level book, you said Christocentric. And secondly, how do you deal with the unrealistic ideals of Jesus' non-resistance?
Well, I began when I was 10 years old, I think, to read through the Bible, 12 years old, to read through the Bible yearly. And that has been a lifetime practice for me now. And I just am deeply, deeply challenged every year as I read through that amazing revelation of God, of his work in history to call forth the people. It's a journey. They get it right sometimes, and the people get it wrong sometimes, but God remains faithful, leading them onward in that journey, which is fulfilled then in the work of Jesus and his formation of the church, and the grand plan that all things will come, that God will fulfill his kingdom forever and ever. It's an amazing story. So yeah, it has its bumps and whatnot, you know. As I say, sometimes they get it completely wrong, but God remains faithful. So it's an exceedingly amazing book.
But
And
can you
the
comment
other
on this,
question
the
about-
Bible's, not a level book?
Well, that's what I mean. I mean, that's just what I'm trying to say, that it's not, it's a story, it's a narrative of God acting in history, calling forth the people, and leading them on in the journey of becoming a blessing to all nations. Yeah.
Okay, and then very briefly, can you deal with the unrealistic ideals of Jesus' non-resistance?
Well, who says that they're unrealistic? I mean, if you hit back, the cycle of violence never stops. And Jesus absorbs the violence and forgives, thereby breaking the cycle of retribution. It is a tremendous gift. It is, as I see it, it's the only hope, the only ultimate hope of peace in our world. When instead of retaliation, we permit Jesus to bring about, through the power of his Spirit, the miracle of forgiveness. And that's a marvelous gift. I mean, can you imagine? I mean, naturally speaking, of course not. But this is the miracle of the work of Christ and the Spirit bringing about that spirit of forgiveness that breaks the cycle of retribution.
Thank you. And Shabir, here's somewhat of a personal question. I watched a YouTube video yesterday that states, Shabir destroys Shenk. What is your position of using this language with your fellow David Shenk? And it just goes on to ask if that is, or what is your response to that YouTube video? What will you do differently to contribute to peace about it?
Yeah, I don't use such language myself, but people, there are young people out there who are using YouTube, and some people put up Facebook pages on my behalf, and sometimes they write to me, do you authorize this? I don't have the time to scrutinize what's going on such pages, so I don't authorize anyone to put up a Facebook page for me. People take clips out of past engagements and then they put their own commentary on that. It's difficult to control, but I do not condone such language, the use of such language. David Shenk and I are friends. And that's not the way we speak about our friends. In fact, I don't speak about anyone in this particular way, because saying that I've destroyed somebody else reflects a kind of arrogance and pride, and I don't take any pride in any of the things that I'm doing, and I certainly don't think of myself as destroying anybody else. So if I know where that video is located, I will send an email to this whoever is responsible for that, asking them to remove that or to change the language as may be appropriate to the circumstance.
Thank you. Okay, the time is basically to the end. I was told by the facilitators I should stop by 9:20. I pleaded, can I go? He said 9:25. There's still more questions. They have both promised that they will respond to these questions by email, and they'll be on the Conrad Graybill website. But I think, again, many Christians are struggling with this question. Shabir, if you can respond to this again. Why is there so much violence, unrest, and turmoil in the world of Islam? If you could respond to that question.
Analysts point to many different factors that contribute to violence in the Muslim world. So far, we've talked a lot about religious interpretations of scriptures and so on, and that's one aspect of it. Many classical scholars have interpreted the Qur'an with a violent outcome. They have thought that the verses about peace were abrogated, repealed, and verses about violence, inciting Muslims towards violence, are the verses which hold sway and which should be followed to this day. Aside from this problem of this incorrect interpretation of the Muslim scripture, we have other geopolitical factors. We have, for example, that Muslims are now coming out of the colonial period. So Muslims in such lands tend to look askance at any sort of foreign influence. And when they see American soldiers coming into Iraq or elsewhere, they find that this is a kind of colonialism all over again, in a different guise or in a different manner. So they respond with violence. Illiteracy, lack of opportunity, lack of freedom within the Muslim lands as well can contribute to a certain degree of tension within the populace, and people respond with violence to the situations that they witness. So poverty, unemployment, lack of opportunity, lack of freedom, so many factors contribute to the violence that we're noticing. Having said all of this, though, we should not feel that violence is only going on in Muslim-dominated lands. Violence is everywhere. I used to think that the problem of people throwing acid on people's faces is a particularly Muslim problem, or is found in Muslim lands, and that, of course, is shameful as it is. But I recently read news of two occasions when, outside of Muslim lands, people have done something similar. In fact, not too far away in Montreal, somebody has done this to a woman. So it's not justified because anybody does it. In fact, it's still wrong regardless of who does it. And it's even more wrong, I believe, when Muslims do it, because Muslims have a scripture to live by and a set of moral codes to uphold. And so they, of all people, should stay away from evil and from wrong and from such shameful activity. But violence is a part of human life. It is ingrained. I mean, there's a certain streak in humans that seems to contribute to violence. We see this sometimes coming to fore from the American soldiers, for example, who are occupying Muslim lands. Sometimes a soldier is charged with having raped and killed a girl, as happened in Iraq, for example. So where does that violence come from? Here are people with great opportunity, with respectful positions, and still they commit violence. What are we to say then about people who are impoverished, who are unemployed, who are illiterate, and so on in other parts of the world? Certainly it is something we need to look into, we need to pay attention to, and we need to eradicate, and we need to strive for peace, and David and I will do whatever we can to enact our great intention to bring about peace as much as we can.
Well, Nathan, do I need to stop? I have more questions here, but what do you say? It's 9:30.
I think this might be a good time for us to draw it to a close.
I apologize. I have about 4 questions here that still are not have not been read. They are unrelated to what we have mentioned here. They will be sent to Shabir and David for them to respond via the internet. Thank you very much for responding so much of this.
Just a question here. May I read the prayer that is in the Torah, which we pray for the people, blessing one another. Would that be all right? Whenever they would be ready to go on a trip, Moses would pray this prayer for the people on the journey. And so we'll be going on a journey shortly. And if the Christians could be praying this prayer in regards to the Muslims in this gathering, and the Muslims praying this prayer in regards to the Christians in this gathering. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine on you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face towards you and give you peace. Amen.
And I hope you'll all join together in. I hope you can all join together in thanking our guests.
We will